Okay.
Ella, hi, welcome.
Hi.
Hi, nice to be here.
This is our first time seeing each other's faces.
Yeah, I don't think we ever have. It's good to see your face finally.
Right on, right on. Okay, fantastic. Well, I guess for the group, I'll just start with an intro. I'm Charlie Munford, and my organization, Talking Octopus, is a small nonprofit dedicated to producing a physical model of agential biology. This is, I think, our fourth or fifth meeting, and we usually just discuss a topic. This week or this month, we're discussing Steve Lehar's harmonic Gestalt concept, and so we'll just jump in. I see Steve is here. I guess Dr. Ching and Ella, y'all are both new to the group, so if you would just super briefly just say something about yourself. No need to go into great detail, but that'd be nice.
All right. Can you hear me?
We can. Good morning.
Yes. Okay. Okay. It's 4 o'clock here. Uh, um, well, I'm Ken Chang. I'm at Macquarie University. I'm a professor of biological sciences. I study animal behavior. Um, Most of my career has been studying navigation. And just recently, I've looked at navigation across all of life. I see one common theme. Every navigating organism uses servo mechanisms working with oscillators. That's probably enough said.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Hi everyone. I'm Ella Hefner. I'm coming from Richmond in Virginia, if anybody's familiar with the area. And I'm a programmer. I work in GPU computing, and I have a history of independent research into formal epistemology, especially what formal epistemology can teach us about artificial intelligence and applications to artificial general intelligence. And yeah, Charlie and our old friends, we used to go back and forth talking about various stuff in epistemology. So it's really cool to be here with all of you.
Totally. Yeah, I think I've been trying to recruit some of the Popperians to this discussion little by little. That's for those of you who don't know, that's Karl Popper, who's considered by many to be the most important philosopher of epistemology in the 20th century. So, yeah, so great. Well, Steve, did you have anything you wanted to say starting off as we get into your video and
Yes, I'm very curious how many of you have actually watched the video. I know it's 2 hours long. I'm sorry that it's so long, but it's kind of a compendium of all the insights and inspirations I've had over the years, all like crammed into one video. So it's almost a little too much to digest. But did anyone besides Charlie actually watch the video? Oh, you did. Green.
Sorry, I'll change my name. It's Mary Lynn. I only regret that I didn't get to watch it all a second time while microdosing, Stephen. It was unbelievable. I'm so impressed with the implications of your work.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. All right. Well, for the rest of you that haven't had a chance to see it, um, the the video begins with my analysis of the vision problem as that when we experience a world around us, that the entire experience, including the world itself, is inside our head. All right, this is a very controversial topic. It has been discussed in the philosophy for many centuries, and people have gone one way or the other. But basically, if you don't understand that the visual image that you experience of the world around you is actually a picture inside your head, then I propose you have no idea what the problem of vision is. So vision constructs a three-dimensional world, and this opposes a standard hypothesis these days that there are no pictures in the brain. When you have an experience that's a picture-like experience, there is no picture in your brain. And I think that's false on the face of it, and the evidence is right there. Open your eyes and you can see it. So the next question is, how on earth would your brain paint a three-dimensional moving colored image? And there I propose that the imaging mechanism is a harmonic resonance. We all know from Fourier theory that you can express any image in terms of its Fourier components, and that therefore the harmonic resonance in the brain as the mechanism that creates the image is the fundamental theorem that I propose. And then I gather little bits of information from lots of different things. For example, motor control. When you look at the paramecium, the single cell creature at the lowest end of the evolutionary hierarchy, and it has little cilia on it that wave in synchronized patterns. And these synchronized patterns are under control of the little creature. It can move forward, it can reverse and go backwards, it can steer left and right. And although you can't see it, you can see the effects, that there are wave-like effects on the cilia, and that therefore the standing wave pattern in the little creature's brain is the mechanism that coordinates and synchronizes. It's the intelligent agent in even such a tiny creature that searches for food and avoids obstacles. And if you carry on up to the Hydra, for example, very simple creature, multi-cell, three-layer creature, and it's got little tiny microscopic tentacles. And this creature, which has no central brain, it has a distributed nervous system throughout its body, and this creates wave-like motions that control the creature's behavior, and it exhibits, for such a very simple nervous system, it creates a rather remarkable behavior, such as the Hydra can bend over, grab the ground, flip its foot over its head, and do a somersault, and it can use this for locomotion. And the Hydra can also remarkably stand on its head and with its arms as legs, and it can exhibit the kind of walking patterns of a larger insect. So these are the kind of mechanisms. It's a completely different paradigm. It's different from modern neuroscience, where they assume that neural communication happens cell to cell with chemical synapses. And this instead is a holistic Gestalt emergent principle of both motor control and perception. And I go as far as to say that harmonic resonance is the organizational principle of matter in the universe, starting even with subatomic particles, each of which are a standing wave oscillation, and they exhibit Gestalt-like properties when individual atoms join into molecules. And I think that this is the principle that biology began with from the earliest days, using these waves to create coordinated, synchronized action in motor control and perception.
Awesome. Ken, I've wondered, as we talked about oscillators and servo mechanisms, I wondered, can you think of any um, counter examples? Uh,
Well,
and
blind people who can't see anything, they're a kind of counter example, but people who open their eyes and see a world, well, there's the example. So I don't know.
well, I wondered, I mean, one of the parts of your video, I have it queued up. I could even share my screen. I think. Let me see. Um, Let me try to share my screen real quick. Um, can you guys see that?
So
No,
perhaps our notion of
No, you can't
I
see
hear
that.
the sound, but I can't see the.
Oh, let's see. Oh, here it is.
Go. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, so I wanted to ask you about this part because um I don't know if you can hear
the
it.
neuron should be revised from the oscillations of single cells to the neuron.
There. You guys can see that graphic.
I can.
Okay. So when you talk about this, like it occurs to me that it's kind of a counterintuitive way to think about a neuron. At least it was for me at first, my first encounter with it, because we're accustomed to thinking of a neuron as something that carries this binary message from one place to another, because it either fires or it doesn't fire. And then it's got all these tendrils, like you said, um, synapses that reach sometimes, a long distance in the nervous system to particular places. And thinking of it as an antenna to me is counterintuitive because it's at least for my first impression is if it were an antenna, would it have this kind of architecture? I mean, why wouldn't it be more just reduced in space? Like a wave can be carried, like why does it have to be carried by those long long tendrils, and can't be carried from one neuron to the other?
Well,
Like why aren't neurons just little small, round blobs instead of long stretched out? Um,
yeah.
is
Well,
it?
from the earliest days of neuroscience, when they did recordings from single neurons, originally they had an extracellular neuron that was just near an extracellular electrode that is only near the neuron when it oscillates. Later, they progressed to those micro electrodes that can puncture the cell and read the signal from the inside of the cell. But the fact that you can also read the signal from outside the cell beyond the cell membrane, and it's the identical signal except phase reversed. So instead of up, it goes down, and instead of down, it goes up. And actually, the cell membrane clearly acts like an insulator, like the dielectric in capacitor. When you put a signal on one plate of the capacitor, it goes through the insulator to the other side. And so the whole idea of the single neuron as a processor is completely implausible right from the start. Now, why do neurons connect across long distances with synapses? Well, you see, the patterns that the neuron represent are the standing wave patterns that it's capable of generating. And if it can stretch an axon over to another part of the brain and get it to oscillate at the same frequency and phase, then it will set up a standing wave at that location as well. So the standing waves are the actual signal, and the signal that's passed from neuron to neuron is an oscillation which is capable of generating a standing wave outside the cell.
I guess I'm trying to answer the question why we're not all arranged like Hydra. Why we have this much more complex arrangement. Like if Hydra can do all these things, then what's the need to generate all these long telecommunication pathways, from
Yeah,
one
well,
region to another. I think you're answering it, but I'm just trying to get it more on the table especially because I think of this, like, for example, Adams worked with Mike Levin's lab, and Mike Levin is always saying, there's nothing that a neuron does that every cell doesn't do. And so if that's the case, if all cells are communicating with harmonic resonance to sort of determine the morphology and behavior of whatever organism they're in, then it has to be, then it becomes a little bit harder to account for for me, just intuitively, it becomes a little harder to account for all the different shapes of cells,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, well, if you look at a process like healing after a wound, so you cut your hand and your body knows exactly what was cut and what needs to be fixed. And when it comes in with the repair cells, they make at first a kind of a bulge, but they smooth it back down because your body knows what shape it's supposed to be. How on earth do you account for that except for waves of resonance making a pattern? The connections, the long-range connections in the brain from one region to another, they propagate abstract information which can be translated into spatial patterns at the destination cells. So, but the higher organization of cells in a structured brain is built on top of and taking advantage of the underlying harmonic resonance. So if you want to control the resonance and have this image in this part of the brain and a related image in another part of the brain, and you connect them together, they're still doing imaging at both ends, and communication is just the signal. Now, if you study Chladni plates, how many people are familiar with Chladni plates? Can I have a show of hands? All right, yeah. Now, the Chladni plate is a steel plate. Originally, you would bow it with a violin bow and get it to sing. And you can get it to sing various different notes by damping at one place and bowing at another place. If you generate a spatial pattern, each spatial pattern that it forms is kind of unique for a certain frequency. If you record the frequency of this plate while it's vibrating, and then you project the sound onto the plate, it will reconstruct the same pattern magically as what was on the plate when the recording was made. So there's an example of where the vibration, both the frequency and the waveform, the subharmonics and so forth, represent the actual signal, but it can be propagated as just a time varying oscillation if you have in at the other end, you have a mechanism that's capable of interpreting that and turning it back into a spatial pattern the same way that a recording of a Chladni plate that's performing a certain pattern can be used to stimulate the same plate with that same pattern, showing that it can both record the pattern as a signal and use that signal to regenerate the pattern. Yes.
So I'm curious to know sort of holographically, well, um I would like to start thinking about how to start looking at this propagation of the wave pattern in the subdivisions and in the whole organism. I'm really interested in any research that's been compiled or that anyone's doing that's looking at, for example, the waveforms that are propagated. I just made a note in the notes in the chat. Um, Decades ago, I was fascinated with Gunther Albrecht Bühler's work with with the microplasts in the cellular membrane that would propagate a pattern, and then they would teach it to the whole cell, and then the cell would teach that to other cells and so forth. And I'm very interested in um, when I was a molecular biologist for the 10 minutes that I was interested in microtubules. And
Yes.
it seems I would, and what I was actually studying using an electron microscope and, was trying to put together the theory of how microtubules actually form.
Yeah.
And I looked at them, and this was before anyone knew, it was like in the early 80s. And I kind of looked at the structure of the molecules of tubulin and I said, microtubules either form by doing a sequential spiraling, they make a staircase, or
Yeah.
they're a parallelogram that assembles. And as soon as I did that, somebody took me aside and said, I'm going to offer you a PhD. And I'm like, I'm an undergraduate. I only studied science for 2 years. I'm actually an artist. And I didn't go in that direction.
Oh.
But I've always been interested in this.
Yeah. Well, carry on. You were going to
Okay.
say?
So I mean, I'm about to get into territory where I know nothing. So please, please proceed from what I have said, if there's anything there.
Yeah, well, I've studied the microtubules as well. Fascinating
Yeah,
phenomenon that there are these proteins floating around in the cell that on command, they start assembling
that's right.
into tubules. They grow at one end and they grow towards a target at the other end. Um, and these control the cells. Now there's, I forget the detail, but there's a certain chemical balance that when it goes this way, they grow, and when it
That's
goes that
right.
way, they
It's partly
replace.
has to do with pH or whatever, but also it doesn't also have to do with boundary layers. Have you looked at Lei Wan Ho's work about
No,
proton transfer? It'll blow your mind. Charlie and I were just like in the oh my gods about it.
what was the name?
Lei Wan Ho,
Can you spell
she
that?
um I'm gonna put it in the chat.
All right.
And it wasn't called the boundary layer, it was the something layer and proton transfer. I'll send you a bunch of articles about this.
Coherent domain. Is that what where's your coherent domain, right?
The coherent domain, yeah. There's a coherent, she's the one who I guess she was a mathematician and physicist, and she looked at how water structures around living subunits of life, including molecules and especially the membrane,
Yeah.
and aligns in such a way so that signals can happen very efficiently via proton transfer. And a bunch of different people have looked at microtubules and signal processing.
Yes.
And proton transfer is much faster than electron transfer because I guess you can just sort of like bump the protons against each other and then rather than having to actually I don't know, you have to look at it.
Yeah.
My
Well,
understanding, my understanding from the couple of articles I read that you sent me, Mary, was that the idea that coherent domain is that almost all the water in a cell is within a few molecules from a membrane or from
Right,
a surface, and in that state, it's like um, especially responsive because I'm assuming it has to do with surface tension that the thinner layer of water molecules is especially responsive and um, that that in essence it makes the entire cell a sort of crystal. And so
right.
she talks about like um, looking at a cell under a microscope and realizing that it was a crystalline prism in a certain
Right.
from a certain
yeah.
I guess
Well,
there's pressure on the water because it's in touch with so many hydrophobic surfaces that are repelling it, and it sort of focuses its crystalline characteristics or something.
Well, if you examine an amoeba and they, wobble and bobble and
Yeah,
they stretch out in certain directions and then pull back in other directions, and that's all under the control of the microtubules. So if the amoeba senses food at one end of its body, then the microtubules grow in that direction and establish, transport, and they pull the cell elastically. They push it in some directions and pull it in other directions.
right.
So what's happening there is clearly a larger spatial
process, which you could imagine as, you know, the densities of charge or proton or whatever. But clearly, whatever it is, it's spatial patterns. And I would suspect that there's a resonance going on in there. These microtubules, they're kind of a little bit like a slinky. You can twang them and they will vibrate. And I'm assuming that there's an oscillation throughout the body of the amoeba, which steers the microtubules. So the microtubules are in response to a spatial, holistic, Gestalt-like principle that chooses which direction to move, and then the microtubules make it happen.
Well, Stephen, you should look at the videos at Albert Bueller's ancient site. He did videos where he was showing the wave propagation, and he was very fascinated with this, and he thought it had something to do with intelligence. He's still around. He's an emeritus faculty from Northwestern now, I believe. But you might find that interesting. But I have to tell you, once I went to some hippie like gong thing, and I was lying on the floor and I was looking up at the ceiling, and there were very precise, very detailed Chladni patterns being projected on the ceiling in the room. And I was able to watch them for most of the time. And I was really impressed. And I went to the gal afterwards and I said, what's your equipment? I have to buy that. And she looked at me like I had three heads, and she said, there was no projection.
Yeah.
I've never had anything remotely like that happen to me before. I have done mushrooms and other things. I'm a divergent thinker. I'm an artist. I'm a mystic, but that was the weirdest thing I've ever experienced. And I still remember how detailed they were. So somehow my whole organism, or at least part of my, my visual cortex, got into a harmonic wave pattern so that I was able to interpret that as, it was a very, very weird experience. And it wasn't like one of these things that comes and goes and it's like hallucinogenic or like feverish. I mean, I've had fever dreams too. I've had all these different experiences. It was like it was being stably projected and changing with the tones.
There was a fellow called Heinrich Klüver with a umlaut over his U. Back in the 1960s, he administered LSD to volunteer participants, and he would put them in a dark room with a tape recorder and have them record what they saw. And what they saw was tunnel, funnel, cobweb, and periodic patterns, the kind of patterns that you see in ornamental art. So this is, I would say, similar to the phenomenon you experienced. And in fact, LSD was a large inspiration to my harmonic resonance theory, because when I did LSD, I saw all kinds of ornamental patterns everywhere. And that's what triggered me into thinking, how on earth would your brain generate such a thing? Now, if you're just in normal consciousness, it's still a mystery. How does your brain generate an image of the world that you see around you? Forget about the hallucinated patterns, but just seeing the room around you and everything else is just as mysterious and inexplicable as those patterns that you see. So it seemed to me that my brain was acting like a resonance engine, like a mirror shining back on itself with infinite reflections, and that this is fundamental to the principles of vision.
Ken has his hand raised.
So I guess, studying various hallucinations makes sense. And we take seriously the proposition that perception is really just controlled hallucination.
Yes.
There's a sort of a spectrum, right? Of how much of the real world is taken in, and how much is constructed.
Yeah. Well, even the most basic evidence of dreams, the fact that we have dreams, a dream is a full hallucination of a world, including yourself at the middle of it, and you're running through the world and having various experiences. Well, those experiences are obviously pictorial in a three-dimensional kind of way. And the existence of dreams and hallucinations are direct evidence that there are pictures in your brain. And that opens the big question, how on earth does your brain paint three-dimensional moving colored three-dimensional images? I can't think of any other mechanism than harmonic resonance, which, you know, the standing wave patterns, they have very interesting properties. Resonance has a certain kind of intelligence in itself. And in my video, there's a section where I deal with resonances in a cubical box. This is Falstad, Falstad. Falstad has a website where he generates these harmonic simulations of like a cubicle box with resonances that create standing waves inside the box. And in my video, I go through when there's a first harmonic, the box just has a plus minus alternation, you know, positive on one side, negative on the other, and then it reverses in a cycle. The second harmonic has two of those patches, and a third and fourth harmonic. They have more and more multitudes of these basic patterns. And there's a pattern in X, another pattern in Y, and a third pattern in Z. And if you can, you're saying something?
Yeah, so Steve, all right, do you see motor control as a, you know, Fourier processes? This was something I heard about um, back in the 80s when I was a student, right, from
Yeah,
Randy Gallister. So in principle, you know, every
Alistair.
three-dimensional movement can be characterized by some kind of a Fourier pattern. I believe the name associated with that is Michael Arbib. That's one of the names. There's these people who talk about this motor control. So all motor control may be able to be, you know, characterized in Fourier terms. I don't understand. Now I've never looked at the math
Yeah.
closely.
Well, I would present as evidence people dancing, even very young kids who never got dancing lessons. How do they dance? They oscillate their bodies, and with the oscillation, they demonstrate the primitives of motor control. This is why young people meet each other at dances, and they dance to each other. The resonances inside their body, kind of like a sort of double check to see, are your neurons wired right? Because people who can't dance, they have sort of like a bit of a neurological disharmony. And that dancing is the best demonstration, showing not that you can climb up a ladder or run down the hall, but there are actual motor primitives that are expressed in dance. You know, like you might put your arms out and then in and out and then in. That's one principle of motor control. And then you go up and then down and God knows what. And you go through them in a cycle, which kind of demonstrates or shows off your ability to generate complicated patterns.
So sexual selection at play?
Yes, of course. Yeah, yeah.
You're explaining why
A
I
la
have such
Jeffrey
strange,
Miller.
you're explaining why I have such strange dance moves.
Well, maybe you got some genuine, unique little patterns in there that other people don't have.
Oh my gosh. I think Adams had his hand raised and Ella as well afterwards.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. So we've spent a lot of time talking about what I would call kind of frequencies, which I think are fascinating. But lately, I've been at least as interested in phases. And
Yes.
when we think about Fourier, analyses, they're both sort of equally, it's in some sense, like you can't reconstruct the original signal without both. I haven't heard you talk too much about frequencies, and so I'm curious, is that something that you think is sort of not that important because to resonate, you just need like a tuning fork and the phases will lock eventually? Or do you think there's actually meaningful information carried in the phases?
Oh, yeah. And actually, the best way to study the phase is not to look at a trace of one signal and examine its phase, but look at the whole pattern of something like a Chladni plate. which is vibrating in a sort of sympathetic, holistic manner with itself. And so the phase really determines the which part of the pattern, if it's like a black and white pattern, which part is black and which part is white. So I would suggest that you extend your study of phases into the phase of the whole, the holistic part of neuroscience, and that's where you will find the. I should mention, when it comes to Fourier, the Fourier domain, there is a thing that remarkably few people seem to be aware of. It's called the optical Fourier transform, and you know
Amazing.
about that?
Yeah, that was when I learned about that in college, it just blew my mind.
Yeah. So if you have an image, for instance, a slide transparency, and you illuminate it with coherent light, like a collimated laser beam, and then you put it at the focal length of a regular ordinary lens, then what happens is it generates a Fourier, well, it goes through the lens and comes out on the other side, and you put another image plane over there with the lens in the middle, and whatever image you put on one side, the other side immediately gives you the Fourier transform, which, if you know about the fast Fourier transform in computer, it's a very, very complicated operation, because you have to look at every pixel multiple times. But this simple lens does it immediately. And they used to tell me that the inverse Fourier transform is identical to the Fourier transform, except with a minus in there somewhere. And, to me, that made sort of abstract nonsense. But if you look at the optical Fourier transform, as soon as an image appears on the Fourier plane, then, because it's made of light, it's glowing like an image, and it immediately and automatically does an inverse Fourier transform, going back through the lens and pasting an image of what that transform was. If you look at this as a resonance, that you've got the spatial image here and the Fourier image there, they're coupled with each other in a very intimate way, such that this produces that and that produces this. And I think that's the paradigm by which this could be understood. So when people talk about there's a Fourier representation in the brain, yes, that's true, but that's only half the answer. The other half is that the Fourier representation also immediately and automatically does an inverse Fourier and generates an actual spatial image. So yes, there's a Fourier component, because what happens in the Fourier space, if you do some Fourier filtering and whatever, you change the image on the Fourier plane, then it instantly and immediately shows the effects of that Fourier filtering back on the image plane. And that, I think, is like the principle of the brain. You have to look at both the Fourier and the spatial and how they're intercoupled.
Thank you.
Ella?
Yeah, thank you. So Stephen, about like last week, as I was anticipating this, I stumbled upon this blog post that you might have already seen, because it references your work, that I wanted to ask you about. It was on smoothbrains.net. I don't know, I'll share the link in the chat now.
Yeah.
But the topic of the blog post is sort of attempting to create a sort of visual image that could prove sort of your theories, and also some work from Andre Gomez-Emilsen of the Qualia Research Institute about kind of the harmonic wave-based computation properties of like our perceptual system, with the idea being that there's a grid of sort of a regular triangular pattern that can be, like, each little triangle on it can be shaded such that it looks like it's pointing outwards, or looks like it's like kind of a divot into the plane. And the idea is that if you shade certain parts of the image in one way, then that, in a sense, entails the way that the rest of them must be shaded, because they're fitting together. And so the hypothesis that the blog post is exploring is if you shaded in just only a couple of them, such that you don't immediately have the information there, uh, immediately visible, you can still, in principle, work it out. And if you were on some kind of like, high energy awareness state, like on DMT or something, then that with the enhancement of kind of the like resonance properties of our perception, you might see that pattern be like immediately spread out across the whole image
Yeah.
without needing to be there. And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that and kind of more broadly, as a way to potentially like convince skeptics of your hypotheses. If you could show that, under certain states of even altered consciousness, um, if you showed somebody this image and they were able to, and you like asked them about a random point on it and you said, would this be up or down? And they can just answer instantly. The only way to do that with sort of like a traditional, like step-by-step computation type of thinking would be to say, okay, well, that connects to this and this connects to that and so on. And so if somebody's able to just instantly, wherever you point, tell you what it would be, then that would prove that kind of the computational paradigm happening in their brain
Yeah.
is not sort of the von Neumann model, but must be something that can solve otherwise intractable problems in like a reasonable amount of time. So I'm
Yeah.
curious your thoughts on that kind of research.
Yeah, well, thank you for the reference. You said you put it in the notes. I'll have to look into that. In my experience, I had a combination of LSD and ketamine. Ketamine is a dissociative. It closes off your mind from the outside world. But then the LSD is a psychedelic. It generates color, form, and motion in that state. And so you can have a prolonged, real-time, three-dimensional hallucination that's totally inside your head, because it refers to nothing outside. It's just a hallucination, and it evolves rapidly and does certain things. And at that time, I was reading a lot of literature there where the people insisted there are no pictures in the brain. We put the probes in there, we couldn't see them. They're not there. And I wanted to like tell them, come on, you guys, look what I'm seeing here. Of course, there's pictures in the brain. There's nothing. But the difficulty is, how do you communicate what you saw? See, the trouble with the standard psychophysical test is that no matter how complicated the stimulus is that you give to the subject can only report their experience with a button press, that they either see a feature or they don't see a feature or whatever. And yet the real product of the brain is a full three-dimensional image. How on earth are you going to show that? Actually, there is a way to show that. Ask artists to draw pictures from their head, ornamental patterns, whatever they want. You're generating from your brain, you're generating an image that controls your hand and creates a whole image, but you can see the whole image before you even put pencil to paper. You can see the image, and now you're just copying from your mind. But the important point is there are definitely images in the brain. And when you're under the influence of various different substances, that the images become more ornamental, more geometrical, more symmetrical, and so forth. So yes, you could do a psychophysical experiment with a key press result, but if you take ketamine and LSD, you can see it yourself there in all its glory and color, but you can't write a paper about it because no one can see inside your head.
Yeah, no, I think when you perceive it yourself, I think there's definitely proof. But I'm curious about like, is there some kind of experimental setup that we could do that would make something that's like legible to people who, were unwilling to try the psychedelics themselves, or
Yeah.
something that can be published in a journal? And because like the perspective that you're talking about like the people who think that there's no image inside the brain, sort of like Daniel Dennett style like illusionism.
Yes. Yeah.
Like if I remember his perspective properly, I think he would be skeptical even if you took, had an artist draw what they're seeing, because like his mental model is like you might think you're seeing something in your mind and think that there's a lot of detail to it as you're seeing it, but there actually isn't much detail, and your brain is just kind of like whenever you focus on a particular part, it fills in the detail there,
Yeah.
but it wasn't actually there before you looked. And so
I
as you're doing the process of drawing, like he would just say, oh, well, you're filling it in as you're drawing. It wasn't actually there to begin with, even if
yes,
kind of
yeah.
seemed like you.
It's a very curious and bizarre argument. I've read a lot of Dennett's work. I even argued with him a few times. He lives in a different paradigm. He lives in a paradigm of the naive realist. He believes the world he sees around him is the world itself. There's no indirect aspect. There are other people who write on this, and they will never be convinced because they begin with the assumption that you can see the world directly. And we begin with the assumption, really? Maybe you can't. Dreams, hallucinations. We'll listen to Daniel Dennett try to explain dreams. Well, you one piece here, one piece there, but none of it is a spatial pattern. J.J. Gibson, he's from the previous generation. Do you know Gibson? He was famous for making this case very strongly and explicitly. But in doing so, proving that what you perceive is out in the world, he fleshed out that theory with explanations, and the explanations were so absurd. For example, he says the image on the retina is not an image. And this is like a dogmatic statement. It's absolutely. And if you make yourself a naive realist and try to see your own retina, you can't see it. It's a transparent, window that you can't see the image. On the other hand, if you shine a flashlight obliquely on your eye and you see your retinal veins, that's definitely an image, and it's definitely on your retina. So people who maintain the naive realist perspective have a huge mountain to climb trying to explain it when there's so much evidence against it. But this is an example of a paradigm in science. It's a whole set of assumptions where you start from the beginning with one assumption, and the other guy starts with a different assumption, and those minds can never meet. And when you argue with people like Gibson and Daniel Dennett, they really don't understand what you're saying. They can't even picture in their mind. It's like you're trying to tell them that up is down and black is white. They can't picture it because they are so committed to their paradigm that there are no images in the brain and you're just seeing it out there. And when they do their own self-analysis, they don't see pictures in the brain. They're looking in the wrong place. It's all around you is where you should look for the picture in your brain. And I used to have discussions with people on the issue of, and I would say, intelligent, educated neuroscience type people, and I would tell them that there are images in your brain. They don't even understand what you're saying. They can't have even a mental image. It's like arguing with people about the existence of God. Some people begin with the assumption that he exists, and every argument you throw at them, they glance it off, whereas other people begin with the assumption maybe he doesn't exist. And those two views are different paradigms. They can't, if you read Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, he talks about this, that it's impossible to communicate across such a big paradigm divide, because you can't even understand the other person's argument if you can't visualize it.
Mary?
I've made so many different notes. I'm trying to decide which one to go with. So, Stephen, I think you left last time before I brought up the Bolin-Pierce scales. Are you familiar with that?
No, can you spell that for me?
Bohlen dash Pierce, Pierce. If you want, I can tell that you're not in the notes. I can just send you everything I put in the notes in an email.
Yes, sure, please.
So the Bolin-Pierce scale is based on the tritone, and I believe an equal temperament division of the scale into 13 parts. And the reason why I brought it up is because most people who are looking at harmonic resonance are thinking in terms of the octave rather than the tritave. sorry, I didn't mean to say trotone, the tritave, or any other division. And this is a division that was came up with by folks who were trying to work with, the idea of the um, iterations of the prime numbers. Anyway, I don't really understand the math, but the point of my bringing it up is that after you listen to it for a few minutes, it sounds weird, but it makes perfect sense, and you can anticipate the notes and you can anticipate the harmonies and so forth. And in studying it, it made me feel closer to what I understood when I was reading the so-called Pythagorean ideas about harmonics. The idea that every note is a harmonic with every other note in context. And if we only look at things using the octaval scale, we're really missing out. And we're assuming that we know the harmonic sequence, but there's lots of harmonic sequences. And our ears are so adjusted to the I'm sorry, I'm repeating a lot of what I said last time, Charlie, but I think Stephen had to leave, so he didn't hear this. Um, our ears are so adjusted to hearing equal temperament that we're not actually hearing the really vibrant and really profound sort of like bone rattling resonances that we could be hearing in music. We only hear those in the strings because the strings have a Pythagorean tuning. And even though the piano and the other instruments in the orchestra are tuned in equal temperament, when the strings do their thing, we sort of work out and ignore the beats that happen when tones are close, because we really want to hear that resonance in the strings.
Yeah.
And so I think that there's a whole lot more going on with harmonics than we are ready to hear. But yeah, look at the Boland-Pierce scale. There's a lot of science around it. It's really interesting, and it makes me think that whatever is sort of like generating and perpetuating these standing waves, we're not going to find it by looking at, music theory post Bach. So that was that was one thing that came up. The second is, I mean, this whole conversation just really seems like we should get the Neoplatonics involved, because, there's this whole idea of the solids existing in the plane of mind and
Yes.
translated down. I was introduced to this from studying theosophy for years. I had no idea I was studying Plato. I finally went back and I was a responsible student of Western thought, and I did study Plato, and I was like, oh, that's where that came from. But that seems to keep coming up over and over again. And synesthesia, um, deep meditation, it doesn't matter what you how you do, it doesn't matter that much. The cactuses or the hallucinogens, there are various different ways, and even phosphenes, where we can sort of like, without too much difficulty, access this sort of like geometric sort of level. I mean, some people who are synesthetics, they see that stuff just kind of walking around in the world. They don't, it isn't relegated to the subconscious, whatever. It seems like it's sort of like a coding layer.
Yeah.
And it somehow has something to do with like orienting, directing, connecting. Um, and I just feel like this is a really rich field for people who are willing to be open-minded and to study philosophy in a sort of like with a divergent look at neuroscience. We could start to come up with some really creative ideas, I think, that anyway,
Yeah.
that was a complete sentence.
Well, if you take a flute, say a flute with no holes,
Right.
just a mouthpiece, right?
Yep.
And you blow in it, and when you blow gently, it will be the fundamental.
That's
If you
right.
blow hard, it'll go up to
You
the
get to the overtone, and you get the octave.
and then it gets to the octave.
Yeah.
And the flute itself has this bias of which you speak, that it resonates to the traditional harmonics. So my explanation of these other the Bolam
Pierce.
Pierce scale, I would see that as a higher order.
That's
That
how I see it too.
yeah. So for instance,
Yeah.
if you look at a checkerboard, the basic pattern is checkerboard. But if you're hallucinating, each little square will start, dancing or,
Right.
doing its own thing. And that's where those kind of other harmonics come into play, I would guess.
I do think that it's a more sophisticated layer. I mean, if you look at one of the things, someday I may write a book about this, who knows? I keep just dumping information into my file about it. I sort of have a natural theory of music, sort of like natural music theory. And there's a lot of evidence that um, ecosystemically we learned from making sounds and listening to each other in the environment, like dinosaurs with dinosaurs, fishes with fishes, or whatever. And I think that we came up with some really simple rules like the pentatonic scale and the octave, because those are really simple and easy, but it doesn't mean that's all there is.
Right. Yeah, totally agree with that.
Oh, and there's okay, so here's another. I know I'm sorry, I'm a very divergent thinker. I'm all over the place, but the other thing that I keep thinking is I think that there's something I just keep feeling in my bones that there's some fruitful study that could be done of the difference between acoustic waves and electromagnetic waves. And it seems like everything that we're talking about in terms of the harmonic resonance in terms of perception has got to be electromagnetic. We wouldn't be generating images in light. I mean, again, going back to Albert Bueller's work, he talked about the fact that every cell is emitting light, is emitting photons, and he did the studies showing that cells are communicating using photons across a glass. So it seems to me like this has a lot to do with the electromagnetic universe ideas that May Wan Ho was one of the, she was working in that realm too. That these resonances are in the electromagnetic spectrum, and the fact that we can also experience something similar in the, in just using like sound waves, it's more of a homology, or than it actually is coming from
Yeah,
the
well,
physical waves first.
when we study something like, say, a microphone,
Yeah,
and say there's a sound wave that then creates
yeah,
an electric signal, but even without that magnet and coil,
yeah.
the diaphragm moving is made of matter. That means it's made of electrons
It's
and
it's
protons.
electromagnetic, period.
And
Yeah,
yes, that even just its vibration is an electromagnetic wave.
that's right.
And whereas the little coil that we use is just to amplify a certain part of that, when you really study it, all of the different sensory systems are really
They're
the
all
same.
using AC current, which is what you said in someplace in your stuff that I read, that the signals are all working in a sort of an AC alternating current.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
That alternating current can penetrate the cell membrane of a neuron,
Yes.
escape from. Yeah. Oh, I have a thought. Bill's theory, cell-based consciousness, um, just thinking about integrating that into this thought experiment. So the microbiome, I mean, we have these, like in the human body, we have these prokaryotes that are an enormous number of them. And we communicate with them through what must be something of a universal language, because if it wasn't, then
Right.
the community that forms wouldn't be stable and unique to the individual, like a fingerprint. I mean, the fact that the community is stable, even if you change. So I remember a long time ago, in a previous life, I was doing research on the cattle microbiome and methane emissions for climate change. And these researchers in Iowa that I met with had done an experiment where they were trying to get cattle to be able to process really poor forage. And so American bison can eat through the winter just digging up dead grass through the snow. So they're incredibly hardy. So they thought they would make these cattle more hardy by giving them whatever the bison microbiome is. So they flushed out an entire calf, like its entire gut flora, flushed it out. And I don't know if they, treated it with vinegar or something. I don't know. But then they put it all into, did the same with the bison, put it all into a vat and gave the bison gave the cow the entire bison microbiome
Yeah.
just by injecting it. And within
You
2 days,
mean
it had
you
regressed.
mean ingesting it or
Ingesting, yeah, ingesting.
ingesting? Yeah, into
Well,
the.
I think they fed it through a tube, into the
All right,
root.
but into the alimentary canal, right? That's
Exactly, right.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
through
Uh-huh.
the mouth. Yeah, and into the rumen, within 2 days, the entire microbiome had regressed back to the cattle microbiome.
Wow, yes. Wow.
So there's a top-down control, but also obviously a bottom-up control because they keep showing over and over that it relates to that cognition, and the immune system are deeply affected by the composition of our microbiome, and so there was
Tell me this, so on the expert, doesn't a lot of microbiome, at least the human research, so it depends on what you eat. So if the calves are eating their normal food, they're going to turn into whatever the hell, the microbiome they had.
yeah, I
It's
think
quite quick though. 2 days is awful quick,
right.
right?
It shows huge changes based on diet, but then given a certain diet, each individual has a unique pattern. You
Yeah,
follow? So yeah, so given controlling for diet, each individual has a certain pattern. Obviously, if you change the diet, it changes the composition, but then if you change back to the same diet, it would revert to the same. In
yeah,
other words, like they have favorite species that live there, right? Like it's like a, oak pine forest.
yeah,
You burn down all the trees, but then the seeds that are there generate the same species again. They have favorite species of pines, in North America versus
yeah.
Europe or whatever. But
Well, research I know it's on Hadza. So the Hadzas are hunter foragers, one of the few hunter forager people left on this planet. And their microbiome, first of all, is much richer than an American's or British. And second of all, it changes a hell of a lot through the year as they, forage on different foods. Uh, I don't remember what the source is. It was in science.
oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, there's been a lot of interest in that because the supposition is that industrialized society has, reduced the complexity of our microbiome in certain ways and so forth. I'm not sure.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's really interesting, but that top down and bottom up feedback is obviously involved because I remember these there was a pair of studies along almost probably 15 years ago, I think, that were featured in The Economist, and the scientists they had put a mouse population on a control diet and another mouse population on a like American diet, high fat, high sugar diet. And they had demonstrated that they could change the microbiome of the mice and they got fat. But then they took notobiotic mice, so mice raised with no microbiome at all that were in sterile conditions, and they fed them the microbiome from the fat mice versus the control mice. And the microbiome alone caused the notobiotic mice to gain weight on standard chow.
Wow.
So,
Wow.
Mm,
so the feedback was both ways. You can change the
Yeah.
microbiome by changing
mhm.
the diet over time, but also if you change the microbiome, you can change the response to the diet.
Yeah.
So I just thought that was so elegant, and it shows how we're speaking the same language with these prokaryotes somehow. Like the
Mhm.
cells are responsive. They're effectively an organ of our bodies, even though they don't share our DNA and they're randomly
Yep.
assembled from the environment, you know, shortly after birth. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
right. Mary?
So this makes me think about a question that keeps coming up. I mean, I believe I sort of when I studied art before I studied biology, and I was really struck by a quote from Da Vinci where he basically said all engineering is solved within the body. The solution to all engineering
Say that
problems
again?
the solution to all engineering problems have already been solved within the body.
Oh, yes, right.
And, and that's the idea that Michael Levin says that, there's nothing that a neuron does that every other cell doesn't do. I've always had that attitude. And it's, by the way, very much emphasized in sort of the basis for somatic training and understanding the mind of the different body systems and tuning into them cellularly, which I've done for years. I learned that from Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen. It's brilliant work, and at some point it needs to be integrated with biology. It's an experiential work, but I could show you things and you'd go, I get that and I believe that experientially. It's about how each of the different systems of the body magnify one of the systems of the cell, and you can feel that cellular intelligence magnified in the system if you tune into it for years. It's related to sort of yogic awareness. But I wanted to get to this idea of my dad was an engineer at Bell Labs back in like around the time I was born, and they invented the modem and the fax machine, and they were working with, I think it was
Wow.
called pulse code modulation. I'm not really good on the physics
Yes.
and the
Mhm.
engineering, but the idea that you can take a copper wire, that's what they had then, and you can take an auditory signal and you can take out a little tiny section of the wave, and then you can chop that up and you intersperse temporally with other signals, and you can send 15 phone messages down the wire, and then they're broken apart and the segments of the wave are remagnified into close enough to a word so that you can hear what the other person is saying, even if you don't hear all of the nuance. And when you think of the signal processing that's going on in the cell, there's got to be some kind of like packet signaling, efficiency transport, something going on like that. Um, or if not, I mean, I think that would be a fruitful area to look at, not futile.
Fertile, maybe.
Fertile, fertile,
Fertile.
fertile, futile, fruitful, all of those words just going on in my brain. My, so I'm wondering if that's of any significance to you, Stephen. When you think about the propagation of a form, you know, maybe there's some way to send an efficient sort of signal that can be magnified in the organism so that all of the details of the structure can be sort of reconstituted.
Yeah, not sure what I think about that.
Okay.
I'd have to study that. Yeah.
Ella?
So switching topics a bit, Stephen, I'm curious what your theory has to say about sort of the explanation behind the difference between like human level intelligence and sort of animal like intelligence. So, in watching your video, you talk about how this like kind of property of harmonic resonance based computation can be observed in like centipedes with, the amputating the different like legs and still being able to see the same patterns so clearly.
Yes.
Like,
Right.
and even in like simple multicellular organisms. So if that's true, I mean, there's this big, open question about what exactly is it about the human brain that lets us be so like, a step difference from any other animal. Maybe some people think it's just like a consequence of scale. But I'm kind of more like partial to the hypothesis that there's something sort of algorithmically different about what the human brain is doing. It's not just bigger, but there's something interesting that can be described like in a mathematical way. It's not just we have bigger brains, so we're smarter. And so I guess like I'm curious if your theory has anything to say on that subject, and especially I think one thing that might be a part of that difference between human level intelligence and animal like intelligence is sort of logical inference. Maybe not like classical logic per se, but something about that has like fixed rules of inference in which you can come up with like axioms and sort of unambiguously have consequences of those axioms that like follow absolutely. it seems that like a lot of our scientific theories and other things are kind of phrased in that way. And that's not something that you ever really see in animals, though perhaps that would be hard to observe even if they did do that. So if that's the case, have you thought about at all about like what it would look like to realize something like deductive inference in the paradigm of like wave-based computation, or do you think that there's something else to be said about the distinction between kind of human level and animal level intelligence?
Yeah, well, I can only speculate. I'm afraid I never actually studied this question, but my assumption without studying it is that I assume that the human brain oscillates at a much higher frequency than a chimpanzee brain, that there's something about the higher frequency that contains more information. The other thing is, I think in animal intelligence, they have a very immediate awareness, and they have like a logic. If you're an antelope and there's a wolf here and there's another wolf there, you're doing some kind of logic where you're saying, if I turn this way, that one's going to get me. If I turn that way, that one's going to get me. That's logic, right? But happening in a very immediate way, kind of different from the formal logic type of thing. But another thing that I think is important in human intelligence is our ability to have a mental image or imagination which is separate from our immediate environment. That while I'm, galloping through the woods, I can think about where am I in the woods? Where are we going to? It's like another mental image, but it's not seen in the world. It's seen in like a separate space, and that seems to me one of the most prominent features of the human mind is that it's able, while in one environment, to imagine a totally different one and do calculations in that imaginary world, which you can then apply to the immediate environment. So in that sense, I would expect that there would be two wave systems in your brain, one of them for the immediate environment, and then separate, necked off somehow, is a separate module that can do its own intelligence with minimal communication between the imaginary world and the real world, whereas animals are stuck in one world. They don't have an imaginary world.
Oh, I think my cat has an imaginary world. When my cat was, she's a very intelligent cat. And when she was young, she didn't have access to the outdoors. And every night she carried on this incredibly elaborate ritual that we could like see what she was imagining. She would hunt and she would find strings or ribbons. And then she would play with the strings or ribbons, and then she would bring them to her dish, and she would like grab them and like choke them in a certain way, and then she would drown them in her dish. And one day it took her hours. And I mean, and she could get open. I mean, I do a lot of arts, and I make costumes, and she could get open any drawer in any box, and the number of ribbons and cords and rat tails that were destroyed by this cat. And one day my husband and I would just very quietly watched her whole ritual, and it just really seemed to me like she was enacting something. It was almost shamanic. And
Yeah,
then when she was able to go outside and she had all the stimulation of the world outside, she never did it again.
interesting. Yeah, very interesting. Yeah. Well, I wonder whether there's a distinction between the cat imagining a mouse uh,
Right.
where
Or the
there's just
snake.
a ribbon, but um, is the cat capable of thinking about mice in general and thinking about a different mouse in a different circumstance and how it would relate to this mouse, as opposed to, the imagination being locked into the sensory world? It's not a separate space, is the point that I would
Yeah.
suspect.
It might be the difference between the obvious harmonic sequence and the Bowl and Pierce.
Yes, right, right.
Yeah.
Well, I kept wondering as I rewatched your video for the fourth time. I was I was thinking about how it relates to the sense of smell, because we're
I had this question
the
too. Sorry to
mammal. We're
interrupt.
the mammal with we've got the most advanced abstract reasoning, but the least advanced sense of smell. And it's often occurred to me that, there's this specificity to smell that sort of takes away from um, abstraction or information in some way. Like there's a unique, like there is a common smell of, if a bear smells like human, like the bear knows it's a human, even if you've never encountered that human before. But at the same time, every smell is so distinctive and so unique that just taking your idea seriously, if it's all cognition is harmonic resonance, that means that the molecules that are entering the olfactory glands are setting up a standing wave of some sort, and that's being processed. And so if I'm getting you right, I think that it seems like there's a spatial component basically to every sensation, that
Well,
there's some sort of spatial representation there. But
but
yeah,
it's unconscious. Yeah. Well,
it's
the
unconscious, and
interesting thing,
something about the sense of smell is especially hard to kind of imagine and work into that scheme because it's
yeah.
so particular.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing about olfaction is that it's the only sense that does not have representation in the cortex. Olfaction happens in subcortical regions. And interesting, when you smell, I say, a very distinct odor, you can't describe it except by way of, well, it's kind of like burning wood, or it's kind of like this, but you can't say. Whereas in vision, you say, I saw a thing. What the? Well, it was vertical and there was a this and that. You can analyze it in your mind,
And you
whereas olfaction is down at a lower level. It's a little bit like um, your alimentary canal, your digestive system. It obviously has some kind of intelligence, because when food comes down the pipeline, it knows how to morph around it and push it along as it goes. And that must be a conscious act of itself, saying this stuff's got to go there, and I got a bulge here, and it's got to, I press it back here. There's some intelligence going on there, but it's totally disconnected from our consciousness. It happens down there, right? Now, we still get an indirect sensation that if you've got indigestion, you feel a little bit, there's a problem going on down there, but you can't really analyze it, right? But there are some people, there was a famous guy back 100 years ago or so, and he would do this stage performance where he would pull down his pants and put his butt into a bowl of water. He would drink water with his butt, and then he would like get off the pot and squirt the water across the stage. So what he had was conscious control over his alimentary canal, that he could control. We can still control our anus to some extent, right? But the stuff beyond it is beyond our ken. Well, this guy had consciousness of his alimentary canal and could control it the way we can control our mouth. So that's it kind of shows that you can have consciousness, which is a detailed spatial consciousness, but it's disconnected from your cortical awareness. You can't relate it to anything else. And this guy had a rare condition where he could become part of his alimentary canal mentally or cognitively, and he could get it under control. So I think there's a distinction between things that are conscious and things that are not conscious, but not conscious doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It means it's a consciousness that's disconnected, like your consciousness and my consciousness are disconnected from each other. But it's still a spatial thought process, what your alimentary canal does. It's still a logical sort of progression of mechanical thoughts, but happens to be disconnected from our narrative consciousness.
So do I remember this correctly? Are annelids, are earthworms bidirectional? Like, do they, there's something about the alimentary canal of earthworms. It's like either end could be mouth or anus. There's something.
Really? I know, I never heard that.
I'm going to look this up. I remember reading about it years ago, and that in the years that I was studying somatics, this experiential somatic stuff that I was talking about, the work of Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen, she would probably argue that because we're all just elaborated worms, that was just the anal and just sort of remembering that it could have other interesting functions as well.
Huh.
And so maybe it was remembering its archetypal anal dentata or something.
Well, a lot of people
Cloacal
use,
dentata.
use their anuses in manners that are totally different from its normal function and
And
often in the opposite direction, so there's
and
that.
I do believe that we have taste buds in some very interesting places as well. I believe that they're on the male gonads, they're on the balls.
Really?
They're finding, yeah,
On
but
the outside or the inside or what?
I mean the random stuff that's stuck in my brain, Stephen. I have a lot of stuff I'm going to look up and send to you.
Well,
Um,
I've noticed in myself that after I eat like hot, spicy food, and the next morning when I'm sitting on the pot, I can taste the food coming out. Not in the full dimensions of normal taste, thank
yeah,
God. Wouldn't want to taste that,
yeah.
but I can taste hotness.
Okay, so that's something to pay attention to. But have you looked at the theory? Again, this was years ago, and I don't remember how they measured the vibrations, what the technique was, but the theory that smell isn't just simple like chemotaxis writ large, because or maybe it is actually, come to think of it, because different molecules that have entirely different size and shape and molecular weight can have the same smell because they have the same vibratory pattern.
Interesting.
You
Yeah.
know that this research?
No, I don't, but I've sort of always suspected that.
Yeah,
For
this came out
example,
like 20 years ago. I'll try to see if I can find that for you too,
yeah,
because I thought that was really fascinating. So again, that would all just fit with this idea of the resonance
yeah, yeah.
and of birds being able or sorry, plants being able to fool birds and insects to by creating a molecule that mimics a sex hormone, for example.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I always suspected that down at the level of receptors, like you have these transmembrane
Yes.
proteins, and then you get this described as a lock and key arrangement that
Yeah,
is
that just always
ready
seemed
to
suspect to
receive.
me. Yeah,
Yeah, well, I always suspected without any evidence, just a wild speculation, that I bet they don't even have to actually lock
I
into
don't
each
think
other,
they do.
that they resonate with each other the way your security key works when you walk in through the door and you just make your card get close to the sensor and there's a radio magnetic or
Right.
electromagnetic oscillation that connects them, and that's my theory of the lock and key mechanism. That there's a lot of stuff that goes by resonance. And did you guys?
It's kind of like the Chladni, it creates a Chladni pattern and it separates the sand, or like when you've seen when they use really powerful waves and they're able to separate water. And then,
Yes.
all of the mystics say, well, that's what Moses did. He created a resonance that parted the sea. So maybe there's something kind of like that that's going on. There's a
Yeah.
pattern that's
Well,
opening up the membrane.
um, we did we have a meeting with uh,
What's that?
this fellow, what's his name? Help me. The guy who was going to join us but couldn't make it, and he sent an email. What was his name?
Richard
Oh,
Watson.
Richard Watson.
Yeah.
Richard Watson. Richard Watson.
I know.
Did
He would
did
have loved this meeting.
yeah.
Okay, definitely.
Did you hear
He's not
his?
he's not on this call because something to do with Stuart Kaufman and Kate Kaufman coming to visit him.
Yeah. Oh,
That's
okay.
why they're
Well,
not on the call too, apparently.
yeah,
So,
yeah.
anyway.
Well,
Stuart Kaufman is our platonic solids existing in the mental planes guy. He's really interesting to talk to.
yeah,
Yeah.
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 Well, he had this presentation, so he has a video online on, I was trying to find it, the music of life or something.
Yeah.
Right, Songs of Life in Mind.
Songs of Life in Mind. Did everyone see that? Have
Yeah.
you guys seen that? Because that is really, I go 100% with that intuition where there's resonances in the DNA that communicate with resonances in the cytoplasm that communicate with resonances in other parts of the body, and that the system that we learned where gene transcription, you have stretch of DNA and there's the messenger RNA that copies it and then it goes on out and so forth. He's saying that that process has a resonance that feeds back along the whole chain, even affecting the DNA in the nucleus, because they're not separate stages as we have been taught, but there's one stage that's connected by resonances. And
Charlie, did you invite Henry Heng to this conversation?
sorry?
I did not, but he's a
Because
good
now we're right in his territory.
no, where he's a good, yeah, totally.
Do you
Yeah.
want
Who
to
is that?
describe it? Henry Heng, mind-blowing stuff. It's about the resonant architecture of the
Gene
well, the genome, but of the individual as well.
Huh.
Ken's had his hand up, but looks like he left to do
Sorry, I
something.
won't interrupt anymore.
Oh no, that's
I'm
okay.
getting so excited. Stephen, you and I should just talk. This is just like more.
Yes, sure. Yeah.
Ken, did you have a question or a comment?
Yeah, I have a comment. So Giovanni Galizia is a uh, neuroscientist studying smell in honeybees. So one of the leading neuroethologists of the day, the permanent fellow of the Wissenschaftskolleg from Berlin. And he has this way of showing smells, translate them into various sound patterns. So I read a little, popular article about it from the Wissenschaftskolleg. I think it's titled "Der Klang der Kastanien." So the sound of the chestnut tree, right, which means how they smell. So I'm just wondering, how they
Interesting.
mentioned it. Is it more than metaphorical?
Oh,
That
Giovanni who?
Galizia?
Of course, it was an Italian. I'm Italian too.
No, he's German. He's
Giovanni,
German, Giovanni Galizia, yes.
really? That sounds
He's
like
at he's
Giovanni
It
Galli.
does. Galizia, yes, and he's at
Sounds like an
Constance.
Italian Sephardic Jew or something.
so back to the question of making logical inferences there. I was thinking about dogs, and maybe it doesn't address Ella's question very well because dogs are so complex and they're also so um tuned in with humans. But um dogs, hunting dogs, they come to the trail of an animal in the woods, and the trail can be a couple of days old. And they go, and so the trail consists of molecules laid down on the ground, right? But the dog casts back and forth. The way they work is when they get to a trail, they notice it, and they cast back and forth a few feet in each direction, and then they follow the trail in the right direction.
Interesting.
So,
Yeah.
like when you think about what has to happen in their mind, they obviously have imagined an animal and they've imagined it which direction it's traveling. And at the very least, they've detected that there's a difference in concentration or in the few seconds that it was laid down, in time, 2 days ago. They
Yeah.
could detect which direction it was going. And they
Yeah.
almost never,
Yeah.
they almost never follow a trail the wrong direction, which is what really blows my mind.
Yeah. Very, very interesting. And even casting about
they're scanning back and forth across it. It gets stronger, stronger, weaker, weaker, and they go back and forth until they find the center. And then I presume they do the same thing lengthwise. And then the end result must be an image in their mind of an imagined track through the woods, and they're following that and updating it with their olfaction.
Yeah.
But it has
Well,
to be a spatial image for its legs to know which way to go.
yeah. Well, the hunters. So I coon hunt with some guys in Mississippi from time to time, and the coon hunters get really mad when they call it a lying dog. Like if a dog lies, if it gets the coon in the wrong tree, it imagines the coon in the wrong tree and it won't give up. And there's no coon up there.
Wow, interesting. Yeah.
And then
Lying dog-faced pony soldier.
yeah, and it's maybe the coon went up the tree, came back down, and then went up a different tree, obviously, or something like that. But anyway, it's a very spatial. There must be. I mean, it just seems to me that even logic, and I've been told that other people think through problems in different ways, and some people are more visual than others when they think through problems. Of course, we only ever have the experience of thinking through our problems in our own mind. So, I know for me, definitely, there's something that feels like a hole or a gap or something doesn't fit. There are all these metaphors that are spatial, or things are, you know, things work together, or don't work together. And I'm not a very, um, you know,
Well,
not a very good logician, but, but that definitely,
yeah, well, I have an inclination towards spatial thinking. I kind of like feel myself solving problems. And there was a interesting example of a friend of mine and I, we got in an airplane and we were flying cross country, and it was weather's a little shaky, checking the weather at the destination. And then suddenly it becomes important to like understand our fuel state and are we going to make it with enough reserve? And my friend Mike, he goes through like the standard thing. He says, well, we're 10 gallons per hour. That's our consumption. We got 50 miles to go. And therefore, that's so many and blah, blah, blah. And it's an arithmetic abstract calculation. I hate that kind of computing. I'm not very good at it, although it is the reliable way to do it. But the way I did the problem is I stretched out the map and I said, well, we started here, we're here now, and we got this much left to go. And then I looked down at the gas gauges, and the gas gauges started full, and now they're about, what is it, half, maybe a little less than half. And I translate that immediately onto the map, and I say, yeah, okay, I think we can make it, right? And the interesting contrast between those two modes of thought is that, of course, Mike's mode of thought is much more accurate, mathematical, scientific. It's reliable, except if you make a little mistake, and that one mistake can totally throw the answer like way off, right? Whereas the spatial way, at least you'll be in the ballpark. You can't be like totally off, right? And I think there are a lot of examples of mental problems which you could solve in either of two ways. And we've been trained in school for the analytic, reductive kind of thinking that's totally mathematical. And I was born with the opposite logic. And it's been a struggle in school trying to keep my two kinds of logic in sync with each other.
right. Intuitions. Yeah. Mary?
I just wanted to check with Ken. I found Giovanni Galizia paper about REM sleep and jumping spiders. Is this the same
Wow.
guy? Is this
Wow.
the same guy? I think it is. And
Yeah,
as I suspected, he's a Sephardic Jew, Italian Sephardic Jew, like my family. Just happened to end up in Germany. Is it the same guy, Ken? Do you think?
I think so, yes.
And what is it that you said that he what did do you have other research that you recommend that I can look at? Because he seems like another visual divergent thinker.
Well, he's a pretty standard neuroscientist,
Okay.
modeling how smell might work, a sparse
Okay.
coding and things of that ilk in the honeybee brain, and what the mushroom body is doing. Yeah. top-notch neuroscientist. So yes, he's written reviews on, smell in honeybees.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I have a question for you guys. Would you guys like to go more with these discussions since you guys are the only ones here right now? I'll do a straw poll with you. Would you like to go more in the direction of looking at predictive processing? So when Adam Goldstein was on the call, I was hoping to ask, but he jumped off, had to leave. But it's not a theory that I find very compelling, but it's so popular. Um, I would be interested in considering it, even just to contrast it with harmonic resonance, or see if they're compatible. I mean, Adam seems to think they're compatible. The other direction we could go would be down some of the trails that we've uncovered today, or like Wan Ho, for example. I'd really love to know what other people in the group thought of her work.
My problem
Oh,
is I read Robert Lanza, and Robert Lanza demonstrates that the future predicts the present, and he is a really brilliant thinker, and his theories are kind of messy and all over the place. And I feel like I need to think through and talk that through with people who understand this at a deeper level, because I no longer I know as soon as I read his work, I started having experiences where time started moving backwards and forwards. I know that sounds crazy. I am a rational person. I am capable of paying the bills. And I feel like if there's anything to that, then I think we have to really fit a bit of fond farewell to our naive um, concepts of perception and of phenomenological reality.
Well,
Well,
so
I've had an experience um, where uh, I was on LSD and I was taking some nitrous, and if you take enough nitrous, you can go like completely unconscious. And I got this experience of the whole sphere of the world of experience shrinking down, shrinking down, shrinking down until it came to a point like an old-fashioned television set when you shut it off.
mm,
Yeah.
Then it burst back open again. The world suddenly appeared, but totally out of context. I couldn't remember who I was, where I was, what was going on. It was like I was born new at that moment. And as the world expanded, I could feel my mind retracing backwards in time. How the hell did I even get to be here? All right. And I
Stephen, you're
also,
going to really like biocentrism. You're going to really like Lanza's
mm.
biocentrism. And I'm shocked that cell biologists aren't reading him and looking at
Well,
evidence that he's laid out.
well, to answer Charlie's question, it's best to have not just a loose theme, but actually have some piece that to discuss, or else have someone present something that forms it. Otherwise, it's just too loose and amorphous. So one needs a focus. So in our groups that at uni, we have somebody presents something which can then be discussed, or else there's a paper that's the focus. Yeah, for example, yeah. So
yeah,
one needs some kind of a focus, not just a loose theme,
yeah,
a
if,
more
if we
I
do
agree.
specific
if we do
piece.
predictive processing, I want to find someone who can defend the point of view that organisms are making predictions. Because to me, the beauty of harmonic
Hmm.
Gestalt is that it seems to give a mechanistic clue to how we can be understanding thinking in stories, thinking in entities and forces instead of data. And that's not obvious to me how predictive processing does that.
Well, if there
A lot
isn't a
of other problems
champion, then it's probably not, that's probably not worth discussing unless there's somebody who could really present it and
Yeah.
champion it.
Do you think that Adam would
Um,
present it?
Well, I'd be interested to talk to him about it, and see, because he's the only one I know kind of tuned into pistolution, but also interested in predictive processing. But he's also like building a team of engineers to work on it. So um, maybe part of that is that's the paradigm they're coming from. So that's where they're beginning. But I don't know. Yeah. So Robert Lanza, Mei-Wan Ho, or other
Yeah.
options. That'd be really cool. Yeah, maybe we
I,
could.
I would love to talk about Mei-Wan Ho with folks who have a backgrounds in physics and physics and a strong math background. Doesn't she sort of take a thermodynamic approach or sort of like blow thermodynamics out of the water with what she comes up with?
Well, that would be
I
the
know that
point.
Lanza does. I
That
know that Lanza does.
organisms violate the second law of
Yeah,
thermodynamics. So
that's right.
that's the problem
Mhm.
that we're taking on. So hopefully,
Yeah.
hopefully,
And you know what else violates the second law of thermodynamics is harmonic resonance, the
right.
spontaneous
Exactly.
appearance of order out of total chaos,
Oh.
like when you blow a note in a flute.
Yeah.
So, Mary, do you want to present something on
I I don't know.
one
I
of
mean
those themes?
I could try to present Mei Wan Ho. It would be pretty fun. Maybe Charlie and I could present it together.
Yeah, and
Ah,
maybe we could find some person or two to help
all
us.
right,
You
Okay.
know, you don't have to know everything.
all right.
Cool. Awesome.
My latest thinking is on random rate processes,
Hmm. Do you
which
want
is
to present?
fascinating to me. I could do that.
You want to
It
elaborate?
would be
Yeah, that'd be interesting.
a random rate process is the kind of event that takes place at as unpredictable a time as possible. That means every moment in time there's an equal probability of its taking place. So that's the very opposite of oscillations.
Huh.
And
Hmm.
life has both
Huh.
oscillations and random rate processes.
Well,
The very
Lanza talks
opposite.
about this, doesn't he, Charlie? He talks about
Yeah.
the extreme unpredictability of events and how that's important too
Huh.
in in the process of life emerging from the of our phenomenology emerging from the intention and the observation of the viewer.
So so that's my, latest data. Well, I could present it
I
all
think
across
that's
life,
interesting.
every domain, whole bunch of taxa. I mean, data.
What did you think of the? Did you see the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once?
No, I haven't
Oh,
seen
you
that.
haven't seen
What
that?
is
That's
it?
what it's about. It's about extreme unpredictability and how um
Mhm.
that's how the universe proceeds is and how we're able to manifest. Robert Lanza's work is this is sort of like vaguely coming back is related to that movie too. Has anyone seen that movie?
No.
It's
Oh.
a great movie. Yeah, I've seen
Oh
it. I
my
love it.
God. I think everyone should read Biocentrism and watch that movie, and then we should talk to Ken.
All right. Cool. Well, let's
May one hold then.
Or Mei-Wan Ho.
Oh,
Let's do Mei-Wan
Charlie,
Ho next.
yes,
maybe on.
yes,
I think that's a good project. Yeah.
yeah.
Awesome.
So you
Okay,
organize
guys.
something, Charlie? All right.
Yeah, good. The sun finally coming up in
Sun is
Australia?
up. Sun is up. Dogs are up and out.
Nice.
Yeah.
Ken, I love your Gothic library background.
Ah,
I know
this is
those
a
are all
famous.
grimoires. Every one of those books is a grimoire.
Those this is a famous study. It's Charles Darwin's study.
Of course it is.
Oh,
As
I
I
know.
said, they're all grimoires.
Nice. That's fantastic. Awesome, guys. Well, thank you guys so much for
All
joining.
right.
Well,
Appreciate
thank
it.
Okay,
you
Cheers.
I
for
think we do it.
organizing.
I'm gonna try and keep it on the first Wednesday of the month because that seems
Okay.
to allow for long-term planning. So
I think
All right.
Richard Watson would really like the May Wan Ho stuff, Charlie.
I think so too.
Yeah.
Definitely. Awesome.
All
Okay.
right. Thanks, everyone. This is super
Ciao.
fun.
Okay, thank
Okay,
you.
guys.
Nice
All
to
right.
meet you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.
Me too, Ella.